how did the two of you come to or stumble upon Laplanche? Like, how did Laplanche come into your lives?
My answer isn't very exciting. I mean, I actually, I'll confess a lot of ignorance up front. Like, I was recommended the vocabulary or the language of psychoanalysis book that he did together with Pontalis in, I think, like 67 or whatever. I was recommended that as a non-pare resource for reading Freud and learning about basic terminology, which it really was for me. It's just an amazing book.
Oh, still is.
Yeah, we recommend it all the time.
That's like one of my desert island books.
It's so clear and it's so clarifying too. Yet I hadn't really thought about him as an independent thinker until, maybe 15, 20 years into reading, like regularly turning to that other book a couple times a month, that I then was like, oh, there's so much more here in terms of the seduction hypothesis, in terms of the theory of the drives, right? But it literally just pure coincidence. It feels significant that I hadn't encountered him earlier, frankly, in his own right.
And then how did you move from language of psychoanalysis to reading his own writings? Honestly,
in no small part because of anticipation of this in the course of the past several months, right? I think the approach that I found sort of helpful was via some secondary materials or some of his shorter articles, but particularly through the work of like Dominique Scarfone, I found very helpful and clarifying. And then Avi Sakatopoulou and Anne Pellegrini, who were leaning on Laplanche in this incredibly generative way. And I was like, I need to learn more about what is this capacity to be simultaneously, again, so like clear, but also so clarifying about this stuff that, like, many psychoanalysts talk a lot about, but don't work very well with, maybe like sexual difference or gendered sort of like becoming, like this, to be like, oh, this is what's helping these already brilliant people cut so precisely. I got to get into this more. And so I couldn't be more excited to have you on, Danielle.
Oh, thank you. Well, it's the same for me, where I, got to know language of psychoanalysis, this dictionary years ago. Mm-hmm. Even as an undergrad, I joined a Lacan reading group. I don't recommend it to do that. As an undergrad, I really knew very little and I needed that help. But then it took years, maybe in a kind of, that is Laplanchian in itself, to think about the deferred action. But it took years for me to then pick up Laplanche's work. And I think also owed to Gender Without Identity, Avi Sakatopoulou and Anne Pellegrini's co-authored book, in which some of Laplanche's work on gender, recent work relatively, is reprinted. And it resonated both personally and professionally. So I agree with you, Patrick, that there was a way of addressing gender and sexual identity that felt much more productive for psychoanalytic work than any of the gender theory that I know. And my own background is not in psychoanalysis, it's in comparative literature. And I did a lot of gender studies. But I was particularly struck by the description in what is reprinted in Sakatopoulou and Pellegrini's book, which is Sex, Gender, and the Sexual, the description of the dynamic between child and adult. Yes. And I'm sure we're going to get into that. And I'll share an anecdote. It's not my memory. It's one of those memories that are implanted because your parents keep telling you this story. And in this case, it's my mom who used to tell me this story. It was always like, being a student is what I like. And already apparently second grade, I don't actually remember this. As I said, I came back for the first time with a grade that was not 100% of the grade I could have gotten. So let's say it was like 94 of 100. And I told my mom I had bad news and that I got that grade. And she told me, no, but that's good. That's a good grade. And apparently what I told her was, well, you say that, but I know you don't mean that. And like my mom had shared a few stories like that in which I kind of called her out on something. And she found that funny too. Although in retrospect, I do wonder what was in that gap between what I internalized and what was explicitly being told to me. I think that Laplanche's idea of the enigmatic messages conveyed to the child by the adult, but the adult doesn't always know that they're doing that, is much more nuanced than this story could, ever sort of capture. But I think there is like a way in which I personally am very interested in the relationship between the child and the adult insofar as it contains all these unsaid things.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. That is also an incredible story. This is so interesting. I think we're all finding similar origin stories. For me, I'm like sitting here. People can't see me, but I have my special hardback copy of The Language of Psychoanalysis, which is one of the few books that Patrick and I don't share. I was like, at a certain point, I got some fun, like some research funding, and was like, I compiled this huge list of things, and Patrick's like, we have that. We have it in French. We have it in English. And I was like, no, I need my own. Like you can't mark up. So like that's been a very important book to me. And I think for a lot of academics who are invested in psychoanalysis, like it has a special place on the bookshelf, and not just the bookshelf. But for me, I was thinking about this morning, and not only did I get really interested in Laplanche's own work, also through Avi and Anne's brilliant book, Gender Without Identity, but I went to one of the book talks that they gave at Barnard that was hosted by the Barnard Center for Research on Women. Shout out to the BCRW. And Avi was talking about Laplanche's idea of the après coup, or as you were saying, like deferred action. But, the translation is not, there's so many situations like this where you don't really want to do the translation, but just this idea that, a phrase that Patrick loves to use on this show, and I think it's one that has become helpful for me also, is the idea of like the blow that falls, right? Like we all have traumatic experiences, or we all have distressing experience. If you don't like the language of trauma, we all have, profoundly distressing experiences. But some of them, we just dust ourselves off and keep going, right? They don't seem to make an impression. And so, it's always interesting to think about like, well, what is the blow that falls? What is the thing that really alters your life? What sends you to therapy? What sends you to analysis? What makes you end a marriage? What makes you leave a job? What makes you say, I'm not okay anymore. I can't go on this way, right? And I think there's something so interesting about the way that Laplanche makes us think about this as always having two aspects, right? Or as two moments, right? So it isn't simply like, I'm kind of picturing like a timeline of a person's life, and then like, one thing that sends everything awry. But rather that often something can have happened in the past, and then something else happens, and then you understand or feel the weight of what has happened. So it just made me think about like time and trauma and psychic change really differently.
It's so interesting. I feel myself wanting to do something that I think Laplanche would approve of, which is to say, well, yeah, it's Laplanche, but it's first and foremost Freud.
Yeah. Yeah.
You're listening to Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin.
I'm Patrick Blanchfield.
And today I am so pleased to welcome our guest, Danielle Drori. Danielle is Associate Faculty of Literary Studies at the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research and a psychoanalyst in training at the Manhattan Institute for Psychoanalysis. One of the occasions for this conversation is that Danielle recently led a seminar at the Brooklyn Institute on Laplanche's work, in which a group of readers contended with Freud's repressions and the unruly nature of sexuality. We are really excited for one of these episodes where we get to put our heads together and think through some key aspects of Laplanche. And Danielle, welcome. We're so excited to have you with us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Fan of the podcast.
I'm so glad to have you and to be doing this material on and by Laplanche in conjunction with our own reading of Freud and our own, Laplanche would use the phrase of like faithful infidelity or of this kind of like working with the text, but trying to go beyond the text, trying to retain what's clarifying and amend or alter what isn't. Insofar as that there was so much in this material and in Laplanche's project in general that was, that speaks to what's perennially kind of, I find myself being confused about or trying to deal with other people's confusions vis-a-vis Freud. Like, what the hell is this thing called like the sexual, right? What exactly is sexuality? Or like, what's the mechanism of action by which the child picks up transferentially, if you want to use that language, what's coming from the parents? Or even like, what's the mechanism by which events take on additional significance, this sort of après coup logic those are like the core fundamental, I think, insights and also problems that Freud wrestles with, to say nothing of the seduction hypothesis, which we will talk about at length, that, those are the things that we're going through right now and encountering in the beginning of the first two volumes of the standard edition. They're incipient to Freud's sort of own intellectual journey, and they're clearly like motivating, but also just opportunities for Laplanche to help us. It's really fortuitous.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. And I feel the same about going back to, what Laplanche might call the foundations of psychoanalysis and being in psychoanalytic training. So I'm, 4 years in, and sometimes I'm not sure that I even know what the unconscious is or how it happens. If it happens, are we born with an unconscious? What is the drive? Those are all questions that he asks. And it's interesting to hear you talk about it in the context of having done this podcast for quite a while now. I mean, there's a good number of episodes out there. And yeah, maybe it is good timing for all of us to sort of go back and ask some of the questions that Laplanche finds, necessary to like raise in relation to Freud. Faithful infidelity, and he, sometimes calls it putting Freud to work.
Yeah, I also was reading a text that I found infinitely useful as an introduction, which is Dominique Scarfone's brief introduction to the work of Jean Laplanche, where he talks about how Laplanche refers to himself as stabbing it with a knife, hacking it with a pickaxe as a way of approaching the Freudian corpus. Although again, it's still like couched in terms of a return to Freud, not in the sense of a whole new psychoanalysis. But okay, we could probably free associate and drift in this way forever. But I'm gonna take hold of the work group, as it were, and orient us a little bit. I suspect that many of our listeners are familiar with Laplanche from the language of psychoanalysis, which he co-authored with Jean Pontalis. I suspect others have picked up on references to Laplanche's work in our episodes with Anne Pellegrini and Avi Sakatopoulou, or in our recent episode with Lucy Fielding on Freud's 3 essays. But Laplanche certainly merits knowing about and reading as a psychoanalytic figure in his own right. So this is the part where I put the two of you on the spot and say, let's presume zero knowledge and introduce the figure of Laplanche himself. Who was this person? What did he do? Where does he stand in the history of psychoanalysis? Can we do a little ground clearing before we do our favorite part, which is getting into the text?
Yeah, sure. He was born in 1924 in France, in Bourgogne, which is sort of a name that we might know from drinking wine. And I'm not saying this for nothing, because he inherited a winery and he continued operating it for many years, I think with his wife and probably with a lot of other people and hardworking people. And he was first trained as a philosopher. And that was also after years of social activism. So in his youth, he identified with socialist ideas. He was also really good at school and attended the very prestigious École Normale Sup in the 1940s. So we're already talking wartime France. And he was fairly active in the resistance. He was young and he was, I think, just sort of carrying messages from one person to the other. He studied under some names that some of the listeners probably know, like Jean Hippolyte and Maurice Merleau-Ponty. So that's the people he studies philosophy under and with. And he went to the US after finishing his philosophy degree. And the legend is that it was in the US that he started getting really interested in psychoanalysis and social sciences. I don't know how true that is. Patrick, do you know anything about it?
I don't know about that. No, I know that he had a kind of encounter. I mean, he was good friends with Pontalis, who went in a sort of different social sciencey direction than he did. But no, I didn't know about the American connection at all. That's news to me.
Yeah, no, there was an American detour. And it was when he returned from the I think it was Harvard, of all places. And when he returned to France, he started analysis with Lacan. And he decided that he wanted to become a psychoanalyst in addition to being a educator in philosophy and a philosopher. And he also, I don't know the timeline for that, but he started Socialism or Barbarism. It was an organization, but they also had a journal. And I believe that he more or less funded it. So he came from a well-off family, winery owners. Well, I don't know what the economics of that is, but I do know that about him. And he then trained as a psychoanalyst, and he helped found the Association of Psychoanalysis in France, and he was president between 69 and 71. And I think it was following the publication of the dictionary that he became the president and became more committed to what we might call sort of like institutional psychoanalysis. But maybe, Patrick, you know a bit more about the project of the dictionary itself.
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. And I'm struck again by the serendipity of our thinking through Freud's earliest materials and the way in which Laplanche had a very direct and sustained sort of immersion in those source materials. So the context for this here is that at some point in the 1960s, a group of French intellectuals under the leadership, I think it's Danielle Drori, we're going to put together this very big sort of encyclopedia of the human sciences. I think this may have been like a UNESCO associated project. We're going to produce like the giant, like I don't know, I'm reaching for like Isaac Asimov, like this like galactic encyclopedia of everything. And as you may suspect, given the ambition of the project, it didn't work out. However, as part of that broader sort of mandate, Laplanche, together with his good friend Jean Pontalis, had been tasked with focusing specifically on psychoanalytic sort of knowledge. And the idea of the series, again, of this grand project, was to like produce like handbooks or like glossaries, or in other words, like what's like a keystone text that you could get to sort of Rosetta your way into this entire body of knowledge. And while the other aspects of that project failed, he and Pontalis spent many years meeting on, I think, a weekly basis, reading and translating and working through Freudian primary source material to produce this remarkable text. And again, the text itself is this, call it a vocabulary of psychoanalysis, call it a language of psychoanalysis, call it maybe like a lexicon of specifically Freudian psychoanalysis. But what it really is it's the product of their returning in a very direct way to these primary materials. And if people who have had a chance to open the text, already know this, but those who are unfamiliar with it, right? You open this book and you get a definition of a term in a very tight way as it appears in sort of Freud's account. You get a bunch of other accounts of you'd also get a nice little, this is the German, this is how the Italians translate, this is how they render it in English, etc. And then you get a series of steadily longer expositions, all sort of bullet pointed of this is when this term first shows up, or this is what this term does for Freud in this point in his career, but how it changes later, or this is how, future interpreters have tried to reconcile this term with a term that supplants it, etc.
It's like halfway between a dictionary and an encyclopedia is kind of how I think about it.
Yeah, and it's attuned to something that I think is, again, really, really both clear and clarifying. Namely, it's what are the stakes of this concept, right? It's not like you just have to learn a whole bunch of Freudian buzzwords. It's why does this what's the work that this buzzword do for Freud? Or what does he try to make this do as he is reading? And maybe it's part of Laplanche and Pontalis's sort of general philosophical background, or the specific way in which Laplanche himself, via both, studying under Hippolyte and having this attunement to dynamic thinking and to sort of the work of Hegel, because Hippolyte's very big into Hegel, or it's the background in phenomenology, which is all about parsimonious language for describing experience, right? And really kind of doing a close reading of difficult concepts and texts in their own terms. But in any event, the text it doesn't feel heavy in some ways. It's a really useful sort of, again, a tool for getting into Freud, for reading Freud helpfully, but then also for dealing with Freud's own contradictions and complexities. And in that way, it becomes an incredibly effective volume. And crucially for our purposes, it gets translated into English fairly early on. And that becomes a huge deal for American sort of, well, not necessarily all clinicians, we'll get to that in a second, but the precedent of something from French intellectual culture in the late 60s, early 70s, entering an early English translation gave it a real impact. I think it's been translated now to 20 different languages. There's a student's edition, which is really helpful, et cetera. But in any event,
and there's just edition after edition keeps being released. Yeah.
And in its own right, too, it's worth saying that being, again, steeped and immersed in the Freudian text and the Freudian project also allows for Laplanche and Pontalis to identify a couple terms that Freud himself didn't uses, but kind of under theorizes, or if you will, maybe another way to say this is, and I'm thinking about this with Lacan in the background, because if you want to do a return to Freud with Lacan, you got to learn a ton of Lacanian terms, right? With Laplanche, it's almost we're going to drill down into the Freudian terms, and sometimes that means we're going to push on terms that Freud himself uses but doesn't define, or that he seems uncertain about. Or in other cases, we're going to mint a few of our own terms to clarify what's going on, chez Freud, as the shape of the philosophical problem behind his terms. But in any event, this makes this a monumentally influential text also for attuning psychoanalysts of a variety of traditions to questions of attachment, this thing called anaclysis, or particular theories of intersubjectivity and relationality that are immanent in the Freudian text, but that weren't necessarily spelled out as such. So yeah, it's an amazing achievement.
It's got this quality of curiosity to it as well. So they're workshopping this together, those questions about what Freud meant. And they, being Freudians, being interested in psychoanalysis, becoming psychoanalysts, they also know that Freud might have not known what he meant, not in a condescending way, but just in putting him to work for the purpose of understanding psychoanalytic thinking itself. So what did Freud repress is a question that Laplanche keeps going back to, and repress on the level of theory. And you really see it in the dictionary, which I want to think of as also like a call for exercising curiosity. And you might have had that in mind, Patrick, when you were talking about the entry into the English language sphere of this dictionary, lexicon, and encyclopedia. And the title was translated Language of Psychoanalysis. So I guess that's a form of getting around the question of, is it a dictionary?
Of genre? The question of genre.
Of gender?
Yes.
No, I mean, I don't know what the gender of this work is, but I do think that it calls for, a kind of return to Freud and a curiosity about Freud's terms and concepts and their degree of flexibility. And so it is a remarkable achievement. And once you have read New Foundations for Psychoanalysis, which is Laplanche's, apparently he told one of his English language translators, whom I've had the chance to meet, he told him that New Foundations for Psychoanalysis was sort of the hinge of his work as a whole. And it's sort of, you feel like the dictionary laid the foundations for the new foundations. So many questions must have come up in the process of revisiting all of Freud's texts and trying to define, drive and forms of attachment as well, while also arguing with object relations and what we might, call attachment theory.
It's so helpful insofar as that the book that he then calls like the Foundations for the New Foundations for Psychoanalysis, which is like his own articulating like what's properly, I guess, like his vision, or it flows imminently from a reading of Freud, but not even like just a reading of Freud, but like an awareness of like what is Freud struggling with.
Yeah.
Right.
Like that's a good way to put it.
What are and I should say this is for people who haven't, again, cracked the vocabulary of psychoanalysis or language of psychoanalysis yet. Part of what's so clarifying and helpful about it is that also they'll be like, when you get to a term, like this term is not exactly clear in Freud, or Freud means 4 separate things at different points by this term. Right. In other words, it's not like think about like looking for like a Southern Baptist style proof text where it's like this term means this term. We've, preserved the sacredness of the original biblical manuscript, right? In our sort of blinker translation of it. Like instead, it's like, this is Freud trying to produce a system. He himself will redefine terms as he goes along. And through being really trying not to like reconcile or like paper over the stresses and tensions of Freud's systems, Laplanche and Pontalis, and Laplanche specifically, are able to be like, okay, let's do something that is remaining curious, but also like going beyond Freud to produce these really, again, both incredibly brilliant, but super clarifying interventions on stuff like, well, the seduction hypothesis, right? Or like, instead of having to learn a tremendous amount of Freudian verbiage for its own sake, or trying to find false like continuities in the Freudian text that don't exist to begin with, you are instead like working creatively with this stuff.
Yeah. I have a question for both of you. Danielle, you mentioned that Laplanche went into analysis with Lacan, which he did in the late 40s. And so much of what he is up to is reading Freud, right? And often when we think about Lacan, we think about like the return to Freud, but it feels like Laplanche and some of his fellow travelers were invested in this in their own version of a return to Freud that was non-identical with Lacan's. But to the best of my understanding, there was a break that Laplanche broke with the Lacanians. And I wondered if you might tell us a little bit about that, in part because we do have a lot of listeners who are, invested in the sort of the Lacanian project of the return to Freud. And I wonder if we can situate Laplanche in relationship to that.
One of the students in the Laplanche course that I just taught, and that really taught me about Laplanche, the course as a whole. And it was a great group of people who really wanted to read a thinker that they did not necessarily know. And I barely knew either, which is, one of the things, now it's like shout out to the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research. One of the things that you're allowed to do there as associate faculty is to take on a subject that you're not necessarily an expert on and commit to reading closely with other people writings by a single author or just around a certain subject. And that was really the spirit of this course. And one of the students has read a lot of Lacan and also felt very invested in the Lacanian terminology. And they often pointed out the ways in which Laplanche relies on Lacan for thinking about, specifically sort of the interaction between child and adult, for example. But there was a break, and the investment that student had in proving, that there is a father and there is a child, or to use this metaphor, I think is owed to the fact that there was a break. And what I know is that Laplanche never wanted to found a school because of his commitment to reading Freud and not necessarily defining it as a return to Freud the way Lacan had defined it as such, but as a kind of workshopping, close reading. We never left Freud kind of spirit, which I'm not sure Lacan had, but I'm no expert on Lacan either. He continued going to Lacan's lectures for a long time. And Lacan apparently was less and less tolerant of students and peers at that point who did not want to speak in his terminology. And I am interested in hearing from you what you think about Laplanche's use of terms such as language and translation in his psychoanalytic work, because one of the ways in which he breaks from Lacan is in not thinking about the unconscious as structured like language, which is the Lacanian idea. He has a different idea of language, I believe. So that's something that we might want to talk about. Patrick, what do you know about the break, this Oedipal struggle? The more you get to know Laplanche, the more you doubt the Oedipus. Yeah. So I feel okay using these metaphors, but still, I should say that.
Yeah, there's something specifically Oedipal about the relationships of, people to Lacan specifically, but also, like these overbearing, or in any event, figures who in their brilliance and charisma both like create thought, but then also demand a kind of fidelity to themselves, right? And I think Scarfone may frame this as like, at a certain point, Laplanche and his peers felt that when Lacan asked for a return to Freud, he was actually asking for a permanent turn to Lacan, which is harsh, but also fair, right? And again, I think, look, we love our Lacanians, right? I read lots of Lacan, but there is this kind of sense one gets reading Laplanche versus reading Lacan, right? That there's the communicative enterprise is structured differently. By which I mean, on some basic level, Laplanche is dramatically easier to read, which isn't to say that he doesn't pun or that occasionally he'll have some sort of statement that's profoundly like Vatic, as it were, right? Or beautiful, or so like a strange reference, etc. But just like the density of those references,
it still reads like French theory.
Yeah,
but nothing reads like
there's so
like
much
Lacan.
less.
Yeah.
There's so much less. There's so like he's only punning in the one language, among other things, right? But also like you get like the shout out to Kant or to Sade or to some. Well, of course we all know this thing from such and such a myth. You get that only once or twice per page, and you get the sense too that doesn't, whatever is happening between those references is more important sometimes than even the reference itself, right? You don't necessarily feel lost or like you have to go and like plumb that signifier. Now, again, I already use this word signifier, and I think this gets at the other half of your question, right? Namely, the relationship to like these ideas of language itself, in addition to how they use language and style. I think, Abby, you're right that this is one helpful way to think about all these thinkers is that they're coming from a very similar intellectual milieu. Like there's an emphasis on dynamic processes. There's this emphasis on like language as a metaphor or a system, right? But as Laplanche, as I take it, configures the question of language, he'll even use phrases like, well, the adult has multiple languages. There's gesture, there's touch, there's the nonverbal, right? Whereas for Lacan, there is a kind of impersonal collective character to language, which is much more tethered to a specific type of, well, theory of language, right? And it involves, these fairly rigorous ideas, or at least fairly structured and complex ideas about this thing called the signifier, right? Versus a signified. And, again, we're in the same sort of milieu where a lot of the things that even Laplanche will say won't necessarily make sense for a classically trained linguist, like the idea of a designified signifier, right? Or an empty signifier. That just doesn't make sense from a position where it's like we have to have a signal. Every signifier has a signified, right? You can never have a pure signifier. But also, though, unlike Lacan, instead of having to learn, like, well, what's the pure signifier? How does this relate to the master signifier or to this discourse, et cetera? It's always going back to this encounter between parent and child.
Yeah, I was going to say, and this is at the risk of being overly glib, the experience that, let's say, the phenomenological experience of reading Laplanche when you're not used to it, but you are used to reading psychoanalytic material, is like, what if somebody soldered together Lacan and Winnicott?
That's so interesting. I agree with that. I wanted to introduce Chandra Ferenczi into the conversation as well. And Scarfone is interested in that conversation between Laplanche and Winnicott. And I think he has, right, one of his articles is really cleverly titled, which is, Laplanche and Winnicott in a conversation which they both survive.
I love that. I have to go track that down.
That's funny.
Because Laplanche is quite critical of some of Winnicott's ideas. And of course, Winnicott was not there to criticize Laplanche. It's not, of course.
Not a fair fight.
But just orienting us chronologically. But Ferenczi, Freud's student and disciple, and apparently the man Freud wanted as one of his daughter's like husbands, but he never made enough money, and Freud was interested in that. Ferenczi uses the term language in a work that Laplanche cites and refers to as a source of inspiration, which is another way in which he really differs from Lacan. That's a rare occurrence in Lacan. Of course, there are a lot of figures who show up in order to be criticized, the way Winnicott sometimes shows up in Laplanche. So, Erikson, self-psychology, Lacan it's not that he never cites anyone. He cites a lot of people, but those moments in which Laplanche tells us that Ferenczi's idea was sort of the right idea, I'm putting it very bluntly, strikes me as like non-Lacanian in spirit and in language as well. So he does care about the reader in a different way, which is not always good, because sometimes you can feel like you've understood all of it reading it, and the translations are great, and we might say something about the translations later. So sometimes you feel like you don't need to make a lot of effort to understand him, but it is actually very dense, and it's probably because the depth with which he mined Freudian writings, the published and the unpublished and the letters. He put so much work into putting Freud to work that there is a way of reading him that can take forever, just like it takes to read like a Lacanian text. But it's not his style, for sure, to try and make you really slow down, for better or worse.
I'm thinking again about this, both Ferenczi on the one hand and Winnicott on the other, right? These two thinkers who are so worth reading in their own right, but that also are like they seem to be, they're just coming at things from a different direction than Freud, even as they have Freud in mind. Like they're working with different sets of patients. They're open to different types of like emotionality, different, basically, I mean, to be very frank about it, like different presentations of like the masculine doctor, right, in their own mode. And like there's something about that that's, apart from the fact that it's like psychoanalysis gets to have multiple fathers, right? Or even maternal style fathers, right? As opposed to this lineage of sons, right? Which maybe Freud and Lacan would have preferred. There's also this way in which, again, I think like it's the thinking with both like charity, but also like trying to get like, what's the radical core of the insight of this thinker, right? That maps on to Laplanche's approach to Freud, and I think is mirrored in the analogies to Ferenczi and Winnicott in the following way, namely something Winnicott says. It's, I think, again, it has a Lacanian character to it because it sounds so paradoxical, right? There is no such thing as a baby, right? Which is like, Lacan saying there is no such thing as a sexual relationship, right? These things sound very bizarre, but also clearly it's a spur to think about something other than just the baby as a unique monad.
It's a psychoanalytic koan.
Yeah, like when Winnicott says there is no such thing as a baby, he doesn't mean like, he's not like driving over a stroller with a mother and child when he says this, right? He doesn't not care about the existence of babies. Instead, he's saying, well, whatever we think about as the baby, as an isolated thing, should instead be thought about as a relational field. Or he's like, rethink what you think.
Can we get into that a little bit? I think it might be helpful. I mean, for me, just to think about both Ferenczi and Winnicott's ideas of like the dyad.
Sure.
So for Winnicott thinks about mother baby and being in psychoanalytic training, I've really learned to use that from so many of my supervisors to think about the analytic situation and the kind of mothering that you might do as an analyst. And the mothering one can be many things, of course. And then Ferenczi, before Winnicott, also has this idea that the analyst is participating in some way in the treatment at a time when Freud is still quite devoted to the idea of the analyst as, a blank screen. And I know you've talked about it many times, on the podcast. And I think it might be interesting to talk about each of them and then see how Laplanche works out a different kind of model for thinking about the adult and the child. And I think it's worth saying that in returning to Ferenczi's essay about the confusion of tongues between the child and adult, and then what is it, the language of passion and the language of tenderness. So there's a kind of a binary there that might be limited, that the adult, it speaks the language of passion and the child speaks the language of tenderness. And then there are ways in which it sort of maps onto the encounter between analyst and patient, the analyst needing to always remind herself that in the regressive position that is being a patient, now I'm speaking as a patient, you speak a kind of language of tenderness to the so-called adult, whose language is a language of passion. And so that's Ferenczi like the 1920s, right? And then Winnicott, I'm not even sure about the years, 40s, 50s, has a different theory of the adult and the child, part of which is this idea that there is no such thing as a baby. And all of them sort of collectively, I mean, Ferenczi, Winnicott, Laplanche, again, this is a bit blunt in many ways, or broad brushstrokes, as you said, Abby, but they are all returning to Freud's idea of helplessness.
Yes.
And I cannot stress this enough, and I'm doing it for my own purposes. It does not cease to amaze me that we are born as helpless as we are born. I've had a lot of babies in my life right now, a lot of friends' babies, and it is really remarkable that a baby cannot do anything.
Mm-hmm.
That they're completely dependent on caregivers. And that is not true for other types of animals, which Laplanche bothers to sort of like say to his readers new foundations for psychoanalysis. And it's really critical for thinking about how we develop. And one of the things that I really like about Laplanche is that he takes issue with the very idea of development. And the older I get, the less I'm convinced that we ever develop. There is maybe like there are spirals, there are returns, of course, always, but any idea of linearity just feels totally off. But we are not born with any knowledge of how to be. Yeah. And that's something that Laplanche really emphasizes, and I find really, really helpful. And again, for thinking even about the analytic situation in which regression occurs, and you kind of remember or repeat without remembering what it's like to be really helpless. It's not something that, declarative memory can help us connect with, but there is some sort of procedural memory. There is a part of us that does remember that we knew nothing, including about fear. Yeah. And that's something that comes up in the new foundations.
I do think we can't sit enough with like what might be called the specific prematurity of birth, to use a Lacanian phrase, right? And like, if you want to be evo-psych about this, you're like, well, yeah, we got all these amazing brain things going on, all these wonderful folds in our cerebellum or whatever, but we can't pass through the birth canal with all those things fully fledged. And thus, whereas, the foal pops out of a horse and starts running right away, we have both this experience of not just like literal physical dependence and needing to have these points of interface with other bodies via like suckling or being fed or whatever, but also literally we got to get the tools via language, right? As our brains develop in this way that makes us, again, acutely vulnerable. Like vulnerability is the precondition, and dependence is a precondition for growth or the acquisition of language, et cetera. And that, of course, is mirrored in some way that may be very anxiogenic to the situation in the analytic encounter and to the therapeutic encounter. And to be more specific about this, I'm wondering if maybe one way we can think about the question of language as it bears on this, and to your earlier question, Danielle, which really has got me thinking, is that if Winnicott says, like, there is no such thing as a baby, by which he means, let's look at the field, the baby is inevitably related, there's care, there's all the other things, you could kind of say that for Laplanche, even, again, he has specific meanings for his terms of like translation, his emphasis on signifiers, et cetera, that there is no such thing as language in the abstract. There is a specific encounter. Like the child learns language from the caregivers, right? It's never just an abstract structure. It's always something that is emergent or that is like acquired in a kind of contingent but necessary relationship of unfolding and becoming and learning and getting your needs satisfied. In other words, then, you never have an abstract relation to language, like Portuguese or Greek or Hausa or whatever. Instead, it's like, this is my mother tongue, to use that language, or like, this is how I learn. This is like, I build the vocabulary over time. Words get additional meanings. I have more interrelations with people around me. I learn to use words instead of simply going for things. In other words, it's a tentative process of becoming and learning that is also what's happening in the analytic encounter too.
Well, but this is so evocative for me, what you're saying about language now. And I have some concrete examples even in my mind. Well, there is this question of needing language. Well, at some point, I guess we're ready to learn language, and our brains are at a point where they can start doing this thing, which is speech. Growing up, other than wanting good grades, I was very close to this pair of sisters, and the older one was my age, and we used to make fun of the younger one because her first word was "stop it," which is, in Hebrew it was one word, but her first phrase was sort of "stop it," and it makes me wonder, like, about the ways in which language is relational in this particular way too. I mean, she needed to say "stop it" probably to her older sister, and so that came out as the first word. And when I think about baby's first word, some of it is related to pronunciation, or the toddler's whom I know and who speaks, sometimes they say like light, but they want to like draw your attention to it's easy, it's one syllable, and it's a way of interacting. It's a way of relating to, pointing at the light bulb, especially when they can mainly see light bulbs because they're still mostly reclining. But then we also learn the words for our caregivers, usually very early. So language is relational in that way. And so there's no such thing as language outside of relationship, which maybe is obvious, but
I don't think so.
It's so obvious that we almost don't want to take it for granted. And here, I'll say one sentence and then I want to keep in that, but like in both these examples, like the stop it girl or the you as a young child with the grade stuff, right? These sentences that we get, these images that we get, they clearly convey something. They suggest something else going on, or the child whose first words are "stop it." Well, something is happening in that family. Not necessarily something malevolent or bad, but just literally there are conditions that are specific that make that the exigent phrase that they have to learn, right?
Yes.
And that idea of, again, like there being a contingent context that saturates our acquisition of language with like personal rather than just dictionary meaning seems to get at the core of so much of what the Laplanchian enterprise is, both reading Freud, his thoughts on language and otherwise, but also in terms of what therapy is and does.
Before we get into what is going to be really the back half of this episode, which is our discussion of portions of Laplanche's new foundations for psychoanalysis, I want to ask one more orienting question. It seems to me pretty striking how a figure as significant as Laplanche seems to be so under-acknowledged in Anglophone circles. Or rather, and this is something that you've observed, Danielle, in other contexts, his work is very influential among certain corners of American psychoanalytic theory and practice, but barely mentioned in others. So before we dive in to some texts, and I don't know about you, but I definitely have some passages that I'm hoping we can really linger with. Before we do that, can we think a little bit about why this might be the case? Also about what questions Laplanche takes up and why different people might find those questions variously generative or unthinkable. And I'll end this litany of questions with one for you specifically, Danielle. Why do you think more people need to read and think about Laplanche? And what do you find to be some of the most helpful ways of approaching him?
I mean, these are great questions. And I have to be strategic in some ways as someone who's just making her first steps in the psychoanalytic world. So I'll let you, Abby and Patrick, maybe speculate about the question of the unthinkable for certain schools and for certain people. But I also understand some of these questions as questions about sort of the circulation of Laplanche's work.
Yes.
In the context of the United States. So just English language availability of his work and his work, as listeners already know at this point, does touch on infantile sexuality in fascinating and fairly new ways, which is probably why thinkers, especially in the relational and interpersonal field about sexuality, have been really attracted to his work. There's a really beautiful Ruth Stein article that I could share. And that's a fairly early engagement with Laplanche. And I got to know it through the course. Once again, one of the students in the course was a retired psychoanalyst, is a retired psychoanalyst who has been teaching Laplanche, but kind of came to see what it was like to read him with people much younger than he is. And I started calling him my super ego at some point teaching this class, but he kept talking about how Laplanche was also had been unavailable for a long time in the English language. So if you didn't read French, you didn't know much beyond the language of psychoanalysis, the dictionary. And I already mentioned the fact that I've had the chance to meet one of the translators who's also the publisher of so many of Laplanche's work. So that's Jonathan House, Dr. Jonathan House, who's a psychoanalyst, a psychiatrist as well. And he founded this publishing house.
Oh, The Unconscious in Translation?
Yes. And it was basically for the purpose of making Laplanche available to English language readers. And he retranslated the new Foundations for Psychoanalysis. He relied on an existing translation by David Macy, who British scholar, I believe. And that translation came out not too long after New Foundations for Psychoanalysis came out in French. So it was first published in the late 80s. But Jonathan House told me, he was very generous. And I met him through a friend after telling the friend that I was about to teach that course. And he told me that when he was reading 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, so Freud's work, which you just discussed with Lucy Fielding in really fascinating ways, he was going like mad. And he's a psychiatrist. He knows a thing or two about like madness. And he was looking for writing about some of the questions that he had about Freudian psychoanalysis that would feel new to him. And he came across Laplanche and Pontalis's 1960s work on fantasy. That was translated into English a while ago. And he decided that retranslating the work would be the best way of getting to know it. And he sent his translation to Laplanche. And that got Laplanche interested. And maybe he saw an opportunity, and he apparently told Jonathan House that his thinking developed quite a bit since then. This was already probably in the early, maybe late 90s, early 2000s. And that he would be happy to introduce Jonathan House to a lot of his other writings. And it was on his mind that he wanted to be more known to English language readers. And so they started an epistolary romance, as House told me, and later they met, and he started translating alongside other people. And I think that's always really important for me to sort of point out that intellectual trends, if that's what it is, that might be a bit reductive, but just access to certain types of thinking is totally contingent on translation and circulation, which is also, it's like the material backdrop against which all thinking, all ideas come to be. And I did not ask how they funded all. I do wonder if I think there is a Laplanche Foundation in France. These are not, I'm sure these books don't make a lot of money. But The Unconscious in Translation has now published a good number of, more or less all of Laplanche's work. They have anthologies of his work. They publish Dominique Scarfone's work on Laplanche. So that's one way of answering your question, Abby, which is that once things become available in translation, and in Laplanche's case, that's fairly recent, that a lot has become available in translation, then new horizons open for all kinds of thinkers. But I do not disagree that there are thinkers and clinicians and people in the field, or people who are very interested in the field, who aren't very interested in this kind of writing. I had one of my teachers recently tell me we were doing object relation stuff and attachment theory. This teacher tends to ask us, my peers and I at the Psychoanalytic Institute, when we present patients, the teacher would ask us, well, what's the attachment style? Which I find maddening, to speak about madness again, and like so reductive. And I think I said something about Laplanche. And from that point on, that teacher would say from time to time, "Oh, you like the French, right?
Yes.
You like the French."
I'll snob out if you want. I'll take that role. I'll both snob out and get more political about the psychoanalytic politics of this. Like, one, I cannot agree with you more about the infuriating status of translation as like a phenomena and institution, but also as like this thing that gets both called for in the sense of like, well, just translate this into my terminology, make this familiar for me. Like, give me back what I already know. But also as like this thing that is undervalued in multiple ways.
Right.
Right. And I say this,
it's absolutely essential, but it's not.
You don't get tenure for writing translations, exactly. Dissertations that are translations generally don't get published. Like there's all this, there are all
almost
these
because it's so useful. It's like the same way that I think often people who are doing like ret comp as opposed to literary studies, where it's like, oh, this is the useful thing. We're going to teach people how to write. So of course, like we shit all over it.
Yeah. Right? And it is this kind of, even the phrase like, oh, this is just intellectual spade work. Well, it's like, yeah, you need spade work is how things get built. Right. But then there's just like, well, this person is just a translator. But I mean, honestly, people who are, and I'm not trying to be a snob, but like we are in a resolutely monoglot American culture. Right. And like a defiantly monoglot at times where it's like, we'll make the exception for the boutique thing where it's like, well, you can translate Lacan, who is arguably in some ways untranslatable, right? And if you're going to learn Lacan, you can learn Laplanche in some way. Like you can learn, like it's not just a translation; it's a whole other vocabulary. Here, the vocabulary is less, and I think it's probably a little less hard to translate in some ways. But the core thing is, translation is itself exhausting. It's hard. It involves thinking about not just what are the words on the page, but what's this person trying to do? What are they struggling with? What are the limits of the language, right? In other words,
it's deeply creative.
It's deeply creative. And it also means that you have to, if you're going to do it right, really sit with the original text and kind of like, well, what's the radical insight here? Or like, what are they trying to do? It's not what's going to get lost. You have to make choices. Right.
We did not even mention the fact that Laplanche was in charge of the complete translation of Freud's work into English at some point, really until his death. He was overseeing that project. It's like the best way to read is to try and translate, which does require knowing more than one language. And it's very hard to translate.
And they're like habits of thinking too, I think, that are relevant here and here, not just like language, but like detours of like, where am I going to spend the intellectual effort? Like what's going to be an issue for me, right? In the sense of like, what am I willing to entertain as something I need to do intellectual expenditure on? And here I'm thinking about, this brings together about the question of this being in a foreign language, but also like, what's the radicality of the insight? I think a lot of Anglophone psychoanalysts are, for better or for worse, for better and definitely for worse, like traumatized by a lot of the Freud war stuff, where it's like, well, the moment you say seduction hypothesis, it's like, well, did Freud believe people or not believe people? What you immediately fall into these very polemical kind of camps, or you get into this very sacerdotal, well, Freud didn't mean this or did mean that, etc. To have a thinker who's like, well, just cuts through that Gordian knot with this stuff we're about to talk about, like the generalized theory of seduction. It just, all these things that you were taught you have to like develop a very guarded vocabulary for talking about. It just cuts through it, right? And so here in this, now I will, as promised, give you the psychoanalytic inside baseball of this stuff, right? I think one of the radical reasons, one of the things that we can get from Laplanche is this idea that all sexual development involves some sort of relationship to maybe we could call it type of trauma, or that at least it's not just about malevolent bad actors molesting children. It's also about like just the difficulty of encountering an adult world and the mysteries of adult sexuality and all these things. And that can go in directions including, well, really having to have an encounter with like sexual difference or differences of gendered sort of identity in a very radical way. And I'll just say this frankly, because among friends, right? The amount of ink that gets spilled by transphobic Lacanians mustering Lacanian verbiage to try and like just deal with the existence of a trans person ontologically, let alone in their clinical like consulting space, is ludicrous. And to some extent feels like a resistance, right? Like a resistance, not just to like this other person's experience, but just like cutting through some unnecessary bullshit in your own thought. And that impulse or that call, and I love this language you used of the call, I think is at the core of what makes Laplanche so useful for us now.
I will speculate also because Danielle asked us to speculate, and that's one of my favorite things to do. I will also do this in the mode of orienting, which is to say that I think if there's one thing that we tackle and we do it carefully and closely from the new foundations, it has to be Laplanche's revision of the seduction theory. And I don't think it's a wild speculation to say that for a lot of people, whether they are academics who are interested in psychoanalysis or whether they're actually psychoanalysts, there are a lot of good reasons to want to put some space between yourself and Freud's seduction theory.
Well, Freud himself wanted to distance himself.
Well, that's exactly where I was going next, is that, like to almost gloss over the entire episode in the history of psychoanalysis, or perhaps just to be like, well, that was a mistake that Freud made, but fixing the mistake allowed for the development of this thing that we now have that's called psychoanalysis. So why do we even want to go back to that? So that, first of all, and just even the whiff of the idea that something that was essential to building the edifice that became Freudian psychoanalysis was the invention and then the recanting / repression of the idea that neurosis emerged from actual sexual violence towards children, plus many folks who would want to look back and be like, I don't know, was Freud too quick to then turn this idea of that this was reality into fantasy? What was lost? What was covered over? What forms of sexism and misogyny and disbelief are implicated in that? You could see it as the rot at the heart of the psychoanalytic endeavor, right? And so I can see, and again, this is all in the mode of speculation, because look, you can't spend a lot of time with psychoanalytic thought without developing at least the modicum of comfort with thinking about infantile sexuality. But where Laplanche takes us and where we're heading next is in revising and thus also reviving Freud's seduction theory, is the idea that all of these things that we think of as care for the infant always contain, irreducibly so, right? No way around it, contain some aspect of adult sexuality. And so the translation issue is probably the bigger issue. Would be my guess in like answering the question that I put to you about why we're seeing, kind of why all of a sudden, at least in my life, everyone is in a Laplanche reading group, whereas like, I don't know, 5 years ago they weren't, right? But I also think it's worth thinking about the sort of radioactivity of the very project of reviving something that even goes under the name of the seduction theory. Does that make sense?
It does. I wonder if one way we could say this, Abby, to say this kind of tightly, Abby, I'm thinking about how like what Laplanche seems to ask us to do is to instead think about the question of how, we develop sexuality. Anybody develops this thing that we adults call sexuality, requires theorizing or thinking about not just like attacks. And Laplanche, to his credit, uses this language, like actual sexual molestation by adults who are looking for some sort of satisfaction from children. Not just about those things as like an exception to a rule, nor still to be like, well, actually, there's tremendous amounts of incest. Obviously there is, but like, in other words, to make the exception the rule. But rather, like, what are the conditions of the rule in general? And how does that activate things that we don't like to think about, right? Or that are difficult to think about, but that once we acknowledge it, we can't not, right? Another way of saying this, and I keep on thinking about this, is that like the nuclear family is a weird thing. In this, like there's a ton of incest in there. And I don't just mean people doing incest. I mean, like, there's lots of like touching and like, it's a weird thing. Like there's something, it takes so much work to naturalize this formation that the ask to be like, well, how do we produce this norm? You don't want to do it. You recoil from it.
Okay, so let's try to do one thing. I hate to use the language of like deliverables, but like, let's turn to the text that Danielle, you suggested that we look at. And I think it was exactly the right call. New Foundations for Psychoanalysis, and see if we can spend the next while walking really slowly through what we've been sort of teasing as Laplanche's revision of Freud's seduction theory. In order to do that, we need to do one preliminary bit of ground clearing, which is to have somebody, and Patrick, I'm looking at you here because you're in the same room as me, and because I'm going to lean real hard on Danielle very soon. So I'm pointing at you to give us a short but fairly comprehensive précis of the seduction theory and Freud's subsequent recanting of it, because unless we have that spelled out, both the actual revision of it and the stakes of that revision will not be entirely clear.
So the quick stab I'll take at this is first to say, this term seduction theory sucks. Like, seduction as a term is very unfortunate because it makes you
bad choice.
It makes you think that like it's a scene of like sultry romance and propositioning, when in fact what we're talking about is a
molestation, sexual violence, sexual abuse of children.
It's not the child soliciting something sexual. It is the adult imposing the adult sexuality on the child, right? So this is an infelicity of translation from the German. There are a variety of other ways to talk about it, but let's just, for our purposes, to better understand Laplanche, understand it as Freud has to reckon with the fact that, one, he has a lot of neurotic patients who are experiencing both a real fascination or really hung up on sexuality, like a lot of his hysterics really think about sex a lot, but also have extensive sexual dysfunctions. And he wants to think about, like, where does that come from? And also more generally, and in some tension with this, to think more generally about how anyone gets this thing that we call sexuality. And he goes back and forth in a variety of directions here, but one way that he sort of tries to answer the former question, namely, how do pathological formations relate to sexual development in the cases of people, again, who have pathology and problems? He sort of thinks about that to the exclusion of the second thing, namely the general one. And loosely, I would sort of say that the initial sort of structure of this is, in order for a adult to have a pathological development in terms of the relationship to sexuality, or some sort of hysteria that masks a disordered relationship to sexuality, there must have been some actual empirical event in which they, as a child, were confronted, i.e. recruited into some adults' malevolent sexuality, or they witnessed something, right? Another event that there is this kind of like contagion that comes from the adult to the child. And that of a necessary deterministic course produces pathology later down the line through this deferred action, right? Once you hit puberty, you're like, oh my God, that wasn't just me being tickled by the creepy uncle. That was an abuse. So it's a crude way to put it, but like, again, it's this idea of sexuality as a later thing arriving. Again, it doesn't come with you from the womb, but instead it's crystallized. And if there's damage in this first sort of developmental period, then that leads to later pathological deformations. After doing a certain amount of therapy with enough people, and also considering his own memories of his upbringing, Freud starts to be like, well, that means everyone is sexual. Like, everyone I'm seeing is reporting experiences of early childhood encounters with adult sexuality. And even also getting into territory that kind of resembles stuff that we may recall, for those who were familiar with it, like satanic ritual abuse stuff, like really wild stories of parental seduction, et cetera. And Freud ultimately, at some point, has to be like, empirically, I can't tell if this ever happened, but also some of this stuff probably didn't happen. And maybe if it did, it would have happened to me. And the way people tell the story, oftentimes in the Anglosphere, is Freud gets a hard trade-off between everyone was abused, or no one was abused, or they were just making it up, etc. And that's a kind of a dead end that Freud has some difficulty resolving one way or another. And ultimately, he'll kind of try and square the circle by being like, well, there's always the the possibility that the child's fantasy, which isn't literally what the child wants to happen, but like what the child imagines or understands the world, that can be traumatogenic. But in any event, this configuration of it still emphasizes a essentially deviant, in the sense of abnormal, invasion of the child's boundaries by a malevolently intentioned adult as a veridical, that is, truth determined thing that did or didn't happen. And that kind of cul-de-sac of trying to navigate, did it happen, did it not happen, what does it mean, can we do anything about it, is where I think that's the Gordian knot that Laplanche is going to cut.
Yes, and I think this is also Freud still at a moment when he thinks that he could recover a specific memory that would then put an end to the symptom, to the pain caused by the symptom and the dysfunction caused by the symptom. And of course, I mean, I shouldn't say of course, but thinking in the psychoanalytic field has developed, even in Freud himself at some point realized that that was not really a possibility. So I'm really glad, Patrick, that you showed us how the veracity discussion was a major part, and something that Freud was grappling with, because he was also devoted to making psychoanalysis a science. So you needed to have empirical evidence, and Laplanche is in a totally different situation, writing when in the 80s, and also reading all of Freud, what followed, and finding that Freud found solutions to what he felt as a really good thinker was not working. And so the Oedipal situation, or the theory of the Oedipus, was a kind of solution, and he introduced myth into his science of psychoanalysis. And I really like that about New Foundations for Psychoanalysis, that it starts with dwelling on the different discourses of psychoanalysis. So you have this idea that psychoanalysis is a science, and the ways in which it draws on myth, and the fact that it's a form of treatment. And what you've been doing so well for quite a while now with the podcast, the fact that psychoanalysis is also a form of cultural discourse. So this is just, I guess, a way to tell listeners, try to read this work if you're interested, because it also starts with these questions of what psychoanalysis is, and it's all of these discourses. But yes, its main contribution is this revision and revival. Abby, I really like that you put those two together, the seduction theory, which is really uncomfortable. Like, it is really, and it's also, I've heard a statement that you made now, Patrick, like many times, that there is actually so much abuse, and that the nuclear family is a strange and sometimes, often, terrible thing. And it's a site where a lot of that abuse happens. And sometimes it is just weird shit, as you put it. And I want to share another childhood memory. I mean, it's, again, not a memory, but this story that I was told many times. And that in my course on Laplanche, we ended up using when discussing his revision and revival of the seduction theory, and how he could revise and revive it without thinking too much about whether a true event had taken place, and whether it could be ever remembered, or the memory could ever be recovered. But so there's another story my mom used to not just tell me, but tell it as a funny story to other adults. And it used to embarrass me very much, but now I find it useful for thinking about Laplanche. Which is that I have a brother who's like 3 years younger than I am. Apparently, was very interested in the question of how he came into the world. My mom is a social worker. She also thought it was very important to tell me the truth, and not just pretend like this happened, out of nowhere. And so she told me about how that works. And I said, well, I want to see it. Can I see it? Is it something that you and Dad do frequently? And she said it was very private, but Patrick, I think you alluded to the fact that there's actually sometimes very little privacy in the nuclear family. I don't think I had any notion of privacy. I was also three and a little bit. And apparently I insisted on seeing it. And I learned what privacy was maybe through this conversation. So I came up with strategies for not being noticed in the room. And my mom said that I became quite obsessed with it, not for a really long time, but for some time, I would take her to their bedroom and I would say, if I sit here and you're on the bed, there's no way you could see me. So maybe I could sit here and I could see you, but you cannot see me. And I had all kinds of ideas of how I might be able to see what she had told me about. And now my initial academic interest was literature in general and stream of consciousness in particular. And now I'm in the psychoanalytic field. So clearly I want to see into people's bedrooms, ways of thinking. Realist literature does it really well. Stream of consciousness literature does it really well. Let alone autofiction. You are really invited to into people's lives. And sometimes I would think about that anecdote in this context. But that anecdote, again, shows that there was actually something, and I'm going to use this word, seductive about, and this is an explicit introduction to the adult world, but it happens in so many implicit ways much earlier in life. And if we take psychoanalysis seriously, and if we do want to think of sexuality as this force that is both constructive and destructive, and it is the force of life, then we kind of have to ask this question of, well, then how does it come to be part of our, for lack of a better word, sort of interiority? And that's Freud's problem, among many other problems that you partly discussed with Lucy Fielding in 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, and part of Laplanche's new seduction theory, or general seduction theory, as he calls it, that the question of where infantile sexuality comes from, where sexual drive comes from, if we want to say that it's innate, that we're born with it, it doesn't really hold. Right. It has sexuality, like all things, we already talked about that, is introduced to the child in some way. And then, Freud says there's some latent period, and then in puberty, it reappears. And there's a lot to be said about the way Laplanche works around that. And it's fascinating. And we already started talking about the deferred action, the fact that the sexuality that emerges in puberty is the first kind of sexuality, but it's later chronologically. And what returns and then becomes the deferred action, or the secondary process, if you will, are those really inarticulate, nonverbal experiences of the child.
Do you mind if I read a passage as a sort of juxtaposition with a story that you just told? It's not actually Laplanche, it's Avi Sakatopoulou reviewing Scarfone on Laplanche, but I feel like it's a really tight account of the general seduction theory, and we may be able to kind of move from it. But I also want listeners to have 3-year-old Danielle in their head while I'm reading it. Quote, "In thinking about parental seduction, Laplanche challenged us to think beyond the material facticity and precise temporality of how parental care activates the body, thus turning some of its parts into erogenous zones, as Freud had asserted in the 3 essays. He pushed us as well to think beyond how episodic adult seduction prematurely introduces sexuality. He proposed we move instead into considering how the most expectable and ordinary acts of care are always already infiltrated, compromised, to use his phrase, by the adult's sexual unconscious in ways that are inevitably and inescapably registered by the infant. These enigmatic transmissions become installed in the infant, a process Laplanche called implantation. Close quote. I feel like this really like condenses so much of what Laplanche is up to with the general seduction theory into a couple of really helpful lines. And the other one that I want people to think about, so I'm kind of working on like multiple like text, story, image, is the image, and we get this from, but I can't find it right now because I have so many stars and arrows and numbers on all of my things that I can't find the passage that I'm looking for. But it's one that I think it can be conjured imagistically, is the idea of the child at the mother's breast and the realization that the breast is an erogenous zone for the mother. And that there is, although we really don't talk about it, and this is not one of those conversations when people are like, so are you going to breastfeed or are you going to do formula? People aren't going to be like, and so will you be being turned on by the act of breastfeeding? But this is what Laplanche is saying, is that the person who is feeding the child with her breast is doing so as an adult who is a sexual being. That doesn't mean that there is sexual violence being done to the child. But rather what's happening is that something that exceeds what that child is, because that child doesn't have sexuality in the way that the adult does, but something of it is nonetheless being transmitted. And that this is the case with so many of the acts of care. And it doesn't, I'm trying to be really precise because I don't want listeners to hear me as saying like bathing your child is child abuse, right? That's not what I'm trying to say. More that babies, infants, toddlers are handled, they're touched, they're cared for because precisely of this helplessness that you, Danielle, that you were talking about earlier. And they are being handled in this way by beings who are possessed of an adult sexuality, and something is transmitted.
It seems like at that point, like what we're talking about is just the bid is to take seriously things that we pledge to have taken seriously, but for various reasons of resistance or anxiety or whatever, have not followed through to their logical conclusion. And one way, again, to think about this, I think, is under the sign of like the deferred action, or the, like we could call like precocity, the après coup-ness of this, right? Because like, I don't know, like they're animals that fairly rapidly after they're born, they start reproducing again. Here, as with children, it was human beings and their ability to like walk or wean or whatever. There's a series of delays that structure how we relate to these things. So the stuff that should seem to be, at least in a very narrow Darwinian account, be given. Reproduction, it's an imperative, are instead mediated through time, through experiences, through learning and the like. But the things that take very seriously are like, well, overdetermination and like the existence of bodies. And if you were nursing, I've never nursed, but like if you were nursing, like it seems to run against basic like common sense, but also psychoanalytic wisdom to be like, well, when I'm nursing, I'm just using this organ solely in the given sense of like, it's a glorified bottle for my child, right? It's as opposed to, I don't know, like the breasts that I enjoy engaging with other things. Like somehow this idea that a person could consciously decide that this only means this one thing for them
in this one context.
Yeah, is an absurd proposition. It has to be other things. Yeah.
And you're saying consciously, and I think it's really critical that so much happens unconsciously. So even if the adult is really actively trying to not think in any way about their own sexuality in the context of caring for children, and it's probably an imperative in a lot of societies, they still have a sexual unconscious. And this is one way in which I think Laplanche is relevant to clinicians. And that's related to, the Freud wars. I don't think you can do psychoanalysis without sexuality. And your emphasis, Abby, on the fact that it's not malevolent necessarily to imbue a situation with sexuality. It's just something that is inevitable given the fact that we have a body. And that's those mundane acts of care are also related to what Freud often theorizes, as sort of primary processes, the fact that we're hungry, we want food, we want certain things, that we need to use the bathroom, to sort of use a euphemism. So all these parts of the body like come to be sexually charged, but they are also the parts of the body that we cannot but feel and that we have to feel to survive. And I think that I did wonder, Patrick, if you taught Laplanche on the death drive at all, as you teach a lot about the death drive. You might want to say something else in this context. But at some point in his thinking, Laplanche also thinks of sexuality as this incredibly destructive force, but it sort of receives its power to destroy from its actually inextricable link to survival too.
So another way of saying this, and I think this bears also on the thinking about the death drive, right, is that instead of thinking about like, I don't know, aggression or violence as this exception to the rule, integrate it cohesively with the things we already know, right? And so by analogy here, it's like if we are wedded to, everybody has an unconscious. The unconscious conveys things that go beyond what we might consciously wish or be aware of. Transference is real. There's this field in which we're always influencing each other. Then it stands to reason that the parental-child relationship is going to be super saturated with dimensions, or even like the hint of dimensionality that's going to go in all these directions of aggression, of adult sexuality, etc., but that the child is not necessarily going to be for reasons of biological, neurophysiological, whatever necessity, able to compartmentalize in the exact same ways as an adult does retrospectively, right? So in other words, the question of infantile sexuality becomes part of the broader question of like, how does the child, in this very precocious way, because of these questions of prematurity and vulnerability, exist in a position of constantly trying to receive so much from the world around it. And these examples that we've been giving of like...
Yeah, the enigmatic transmissions, or the enigmatic signifiers. This is something I find so interesting from Laplanche.
And that's, and think about that, like these examples we've been sharing about like kids basically... Well, I think about that section in the old Reader's Digest magazines. I don't know if they still make those, right? But like kids say the darndest things, where it's like these kids are saying things that are like, oh, they really know what's going on, or like from the mouths of babes come these insights. That, again, that's something we all know. Like the kids are picking up more than we think that they are. Or like the kid is built to be picking up things and processing things and being curious about things.
Laplanche would say that the child is constantly translating, but that goes beyond just childhood. But he uses the term translation, and he also says we are meaning-making creatures, which again, may be stating the obvious and very true to his sort of philosophical form, but it bears saying again that we are meaning-making creatures. And that's one of like the only things that we might be able to know about the self for sure, that we try to make meaning, we come into language, we talked about all those things. To be somewhat like didactic about it, I wanted to put it out there that Laplanche uses the concept of the fundamental anthropological situation
yes,
to describe what we've been talking about. Which is that relationship between an adult who already has a sexual unconscious, has sexuality, and a nursling, an infant, in Ferenczi's words, a creature who can only speak the language of tenderness and not the language of passion, if they can speak at all. And that's a helpless creature. And Freud has this concept of helplessness. And it's this fundamental anthropological situation that makes that sort of sets the scene for translation of those enigmatic messages and signifiers.
But to put that in other words, right? And this gets, I think, the core radicalness of the insight. The Laplanchian ask is to universalize as a general condition across different types of families, the nuclear family, the Oedipal family, the Western family, whatever. But beyond that, the fact of like our inevitably picking up on stuff that adults consider to be the sexual in an infantile mode as a condition of our being weaned. And to that end, I want to just read a paragraph, a couple sentences from Laplanche here, and they're about that broader condition of like receptivity, of picking up things. But just, we can read this as being also specifically about sexuality and about language, right? Insofar as about relating to the world. The adult world is not an objective world that the child discovers and learns about in the way it learns to walk or to manipulate objects. It is characterized by messages in the most general sense of the term, linguistic or simply related to language, pre-linguistic or even paralinguistic. Messages present the child with questions he cannot yet understand, but to which he has to attribute meaning, to which he has to respond. Those are one and the same thing. So to gloss this, it's like there is the sexual, the universal seduction, if you want to call it that, is like that, it's a thing that's communicated, but that is not propositionally present or legible to the child about their own and adult sexuality. And that relationship is, again, also is structural, it's inevitable. There's no way around it. It also, I think, in this idea, and this is what I wanted to cue us up for, this encounter with the other, who is giving you enigmatic messages that activate your most basic conditions of helplessness, of desire to know, of desire to become, of becoming, etc. It mirrors the analytic one, or at least it says something about it.
Yes. I want to add to that before we get to the analytic situation. And it is incredibly frustrating that Laplanche doesn't write about his cases, that he does not really write clinically. I mean, he has a few papers in which he addresses termination and he addresses interpretation, which is not something that he advocated for, interpretation. But he also, of course, again, true to philosophical form, wants to define interpretation, which is not easy at all. The three of us know that from our other fields too. But I wanted to say, before we get to the analytic situation, that Laplanche also provides us with this somewhat simple and I think useful definition of repression through this explanation of the fundamental anthropological situation and how the child, as you read to us, Patrick, is in a condition of constant translation of messages that they cannot really translate. And those things that don't even get translated, some things probably get mistranslated, some things get translated in all kinds of ways in the encounters with all kinds of adults, again, to try and put it concretely, but some things don't even get translated. There are the sort of residue of the translation process. And that's the repressed for Laplanche. And again, he would say this is just a close reading of Freud, but those things, just like we have no access to them, we have no language for them. And to get there in the analytic situation, so now we're with the clinical implications. I don't even know how to answer this question. I can feel the desire to go there with patients, to go there as a patient, to be in that space of the enigmatic, to be in that space of really feeling like a kind of helplessness. We feel it in all kinds of ways, but as soon as we do, all in the mechanisms of defense and transference, which is in a way a mechanism of defense, they all, kick in. Yeah. So those failures to translate are repression. And we might know that if we're interested in psychoanalysis, that's what we want to target in the psychoanalytic situation. How do we do that?
That's such a good question. And I wonder if maybe, I don't want to appeal to the spirit of the enterprise too abstractly or to do a metaphor on this, right? But I do think about how, and actually maybe this will help us, you and me, Danielle, from our perspective as comparative literature people, right? That old line about translation is impossible. Like, I can't give you a translation of a poem from one language to another that's going to convey every single rhyme, reference, bit of meaning, association, etc., that it had in the original language. Right? This is the Italians make that joke, right? Trattore, traditore, like the translator is the traitor, right? But people still translate poetry. Poems are beautiful, right? The fact of the inability to translate or to convey something in a one-to-one linear mode is not a limit on the enterprise of translation. You could paradoxically say it's kind of the condition of possibility, right? And that, in terms of the spirit, emphasizes to me what, again, I think is the radical core of this project and why some analysts turn to it more than others, and why I want people to read more Laplanche because of our conversation now, but just in general, where it's an emphasis on the creative, right? And not about like going back to the original source text. It's like, wow, and this is why I think it does work for a lot of thinking about gender identity, right? Like my chosen objects, what I find like my type, that's not set. My identity is a process. It's creative. A thing that happened to me that was traumatic, that doesn't have to define me. I get to keep on doing this work. And it's not about like decoding what was behind the enigmatic signifier given me to an adult. Well, you can never get that. Instead, you can go somewhere from the structure that gave you. And so there's this emphasis here on the unbinding as creative, to use that language, right? Or to use the astronomical language that Laplanche also likes. It's a pivoting from thinking about yourself as the center of the universe to thinking about others as involving, like, rotating around them. That movement opens stuff up, right? So it's rather than giving you firm answers, it allows you to ask better questions. And that seems so obvious on some level, but so hard to both honor and to theoretically ground. And yet he does it.
Danielle, if people want to study with you, whether Laplanche or otherwise, where can they find more about you?
I teach mainly through the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research. So I'd love you to link to my faculty page at Brooklyn Institute for Social Research. We're actually doing an event soon about the marriage question, which is a book by philosopher and literary scholar Claire Carlyle. And that's going to be a Valentine's Day event. So I don't know actually when this episode is going to be out, but if people are listening to it and they're in New York and it's before Valentine's Day 2026, we're going to do it at Liz's Book Bar, which that's really worth knowing about. It's a great independent bookstore in Carroll Gardens in Brooklyn. And it's going to be an event that's partly about George Eliot. And I think actually the next Brooklyn Institute that I'm going to teach is not psychoanalytic at all, but so psychoanalytic. And it's going to be probably George Eliot. I'm really grateful for this time with you.
Oh, this was so much fun. Delightful. And also I love George Eliot. So maybe I need to come sit in on your class. Danielle, this has been such a joy. Thank you so much.
Really.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Ordinary Unhappiness. If you enjoyed the episode and you'd like to support the podcast, which is completely made possible and kept ad-free for everyone by the generosity of our Patreon supporters, please head on over to patreon.com/ordinaryunhappiness. When you support the show, you'll also get 2 additional Patreon-only episodes per month, including our Wild Analysis series and our Journey Through Freud's Standard Edition. has been an episode of Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin, and today I was joined by Patrick Blanchfield and Danielle Drori. This podcast is produced by Dan Yowell. Theme music by Formal Chicken.